We're really glad to be here this morning. I appreciate Dan setting the bar really low. I guess if I'm impersonating a minister, this has to only approximate a sermon. So we should. I'm not feeling nervous now, but we are glad to be here. We always love being here. We were reminiscing with Janice before we started that. Sally and I first came here 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the first Sunday of June. And at that time, I served as interim minister when we were between ministers. And so we were here every Sunday for about 6 months at that time. And then have been here off and on since then, including another extended stint, again, between ministers. And occasionally, the last time before Matthew came. But we love this place. It's always been very good for us. We were, again, reminiscing with Janice. When we first came here, it was at an extremely challenging point in our lives. We just lost a son in an accident 2 weeks before we started here. And 2 weeks before I was asked to come. It was about a month by the time we actually got here. Very challenging time in our lives, and this place was a place of great healing for us. And we love this place. That was good. Most of you weren't here 20 years ago. But I was a teenager. I don't know if I mentioned that. I was with a teenage son somehow. I don't know how that had happened. But anyway, we're glad to be here and to worship with you. You know, as Christians, we consider the possibility of an abundant life. We think about that somehow God's supposed to use us. I'm not sure use me for what, or use me where, or I don't know if God can use me. And thank you for the reference. If you read the writings of Francis Chan, you really wonder, where do I fit? And I'm pretty sure I should be doing more than I'm doing if you read the writings of Francis Chan. But I think I'm a small person. I'm not an important, powerful person. I'm limited in abilities and talents. I'm fairly limited in opportunities. I don't know that what I do matters very much or is very important. And I think it's helpful to remember sometimes. I feel very small, but it's helpful to remember that with God, there are no little people. It might encourage us to see how God used Moses' rod. I brought a stick today. I found out after I got here that the shepherds here have a much more impressive stick than this one, and I should have borrowed one if I had known that they had. I have a feeling that Moses' rod was bigger than this, but this is the biggest stick I had. So it will just have to do. In my mind, Moses' stick's bigger than this, but this is a stick. We can all recognize that's a stick. And it may encourage us to see how God used a stick. When God spoke to Moses and told him to go and challenge Egypt, Moses was not very excited about that plan, had a lot of questions, a lot of excuses. But it just so happened that during that conversation, Moses had a stick in his hand. That was not unusual since he was a shepherd. So he had a big stick in his hand. And Moses had objections. He said, I'm not sure who you are in the first place. I'm not sure who I am. They're not going to believe me. They're going to say, God didn't send you. And that's my favorite of the things Moses said, because that just seems so real. So suppose I said, God spoke to me and told me to come here, and you would say, no, he didn't. God didn't speak to you. And so Moses is anticipating that. He's going to show up in Egypt. Nobody's going to have a clue who he is. He's going to say, hey, God sent me to a bunch of slaves, and they're going to say, no, he didn't. So that was a pretty legitimate concern. And so in the midst of that conversation, God almost seems to be a little frustrated with Moses. And so he asked Moses, hey, what's that? I think Moses recognized that was a rhetorical question. That wouldn't give you much confidence in God if he didn't know what a stick was. But God asked Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses said, well, Lord, this is a stick. And you remember God said, drop it on the ground. Wait for it. No, I'm not going to drive it. That would be great. I wish I was a magician, but that would be, a sermon everybody go home talking about if suddenly we had a large snake up here. But he told Moses to drop the stick, and of course, when he dropped the stick, it turned into a snake. That would make a big snake. Yeah, so it turned into a snake, and then God, of course, told him to pick up the snake. That was a test of faith. Grab that thing by the tail. And so he did, and it turned back into a stick again. And so with that, Moses heads off to Egypt. The passage was read a moment ago from Exodus chapter 4, and there's one key statement that really jumps out at me out of that passage. So Moses is going to head off to Egypt. He tells his father-in-law, got to tell family if you're going out of town. Tells his father-in-law, I need to go to Egypt and see what's going on with my people back there. And so they head off on that trip. Moses took his wife and his sons, mounted them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. Now, I don't know what all Moses carried with him. I don't know if they had any luggage, if he had a change of clothes. Was he wearing a backpack? What did they take with them? I don't know, except for one thing that we're told about. It says, and Moses took the staff. Oh, but there's more. It says Moses took the staff of God in his hand. The staff of God. Somehow, the staff of Moses had become the staff of God. Now, through the rest of the book, it's going to always be referred to as Moses' staff from then on. But in that moment, there was a recognition that this is God's stick. It's God's stick. And off Moses went to Egypt with God's stick. When he got to Egypt, a number of things happened, of course. The first thing, when Pharaoh, of course, not going to let them go, and Moses does the rod to a snake trick, and that's pretty impressive. That gets Pharaoh's attention. It becomes a serpent. And then God tells Moses to go down and meet Pharaoh when he comes out to the Nile River. And when Pharaoh comes out to the Nile River, you take the stick and hit the water with it. And when you do that, the river's going to turn to blood, and all the fish in it will die, and there'll be no drinking water. And so Moses does that. And over the coming days, that stick is used to bring about frogs, to bring about lice. The stick is used to cause what may have been the worst thunderstorm in the history of the world, with hail and lightning like no one had ever seen before. The hail was so bad it killed all animals. Everything that was outside died. It was done with that stick. Do you think at some point the Egyptians were thinking, somebody's got to get that stick away from him? Because this stick is bringing about all of these things. After the lightning and hailstorm, locust. He used the stick, and locust came and ate all the vegetation. After the locust, he used the stick to bring about darkness. So it was darkness you could feel, that kind of darkness everywhere. Over and over again, the stick, it's the same stick that Moses had back on the side of the mountain in the Midian. That same stick is now accomplishing all of these things. Same stick he had poked at sheep with, had knocked rocks out of the way. The same old stick he had leaned on to walk on uneven ground. Now that stick was doing all these incredible things. So Pharaoh changed his mind, let the people go. But remember, he changed his mind again and decided not to let them go. And he heads out after them. The armies of Pharaoh trapped the Israelites against the Red Sea. And when it looked like all was lost, God said, hold the stick up over the water. And when he did, the seas began to part and they could cross on dry land. What had been a tool of destruction became a tool of salvation. Over the years, the rod was used in military victories. It was used to settle disputes, to quiet grumbling. Over and over again, that stick shows up in the story. 40 years later, it was still being used, and it still figured in the story. All the mighty ways that God used a stick. Now, let me think again about why I can't do anything. Because I apparently am less than a stick. If God could do all that with a stick, and to all observers, it looked like the stick was doing it. Every time the stick would bring about a plague. The stick would change water to blood. The stick would bring water from a rock. The stick would do all. The stick, and of course we know, no. It's not the stick doing it. It sure looked like it was the stick doing it. The stick was certainly involved, but we, of course, realized there was more to it than the stick. I'm going to put this down before I drop it. Much more to it than a stick. But the key, I think, was back that first verse, that the stick had become the stick of God. It was no longer just Moses' rod, but the rod of God. I have to become the me of God. The point is not what am I able to do, what are my talents, what are my abilities, what are my, it's not really about me. When I become the person of God, then I can become useful in God's hands. The scriptures say a lot about the fact that much can come from little when that little is dedicated to God. We referred to the feeding of the 5,000 a few moments ago during communion. And you think of that story. What are the key elements in that story? Well, there's a boy, and there's a lunch. The boy's got a lunch. They're the apostles. There's the crowd. And so what happens? Well, somehow or other, Andrew gets this lunch from this boy, and they have everybody sit down, and then the apostles hand this food out to all these people. And that's what happened. Except I've left out kind of an important element there, haven't I? I've left out how that happened. I told you what happened. Jesus is completely uninvolved in this story. He's not handing out the food. He didn't find the boy. But of course, Jesus is the only reason that story happened. But if we had been there watching, we wouldn't have seen Jesus do anything. But when that little boy's lunch, came under the power of Jesus, then some regular ordinary people could take a regular ordinary kid's lunch and feed thousands of people. But again, the key element in the story, of course, is Jesus. Not the boy, not the lunch, not the apostles. But that's not what you would have seen if we had been there. So, we sometimes think it's all about the lunch. It's all about me. But in fact, it's not about the lunch. It's about the lunch being turned over to the power of God. So the problem for each of us is just applying that to ourselves. So, seeing myself as not a talented person or a gifted person or not a talented person or a gifted person, but just seeing myself as a person who belongs to God. And so, in that case, in that sense, there are no little people. There are only people who have given their lives to God. So does that mean once I do that, if I turn myself over to God, then I get a big important job? Then I'll serve in some dramatic way or do some great thing. Maybe you think I might feed 5,000 people with a boy's lunch? I guess it's possible, not likely, but will I serve in some big way instead of in just little ways? Well, just like there are no little people, there are also no little places. If only I were an important person in position and power. But that's the thinking of the world. The little boy who's sitting in a big office chair dreaming one day I'll be a boss. Maybe so. But the Bible teaches us that to get to greatness, that comes through service. And certainly Jesus illustrated that in his own life. In Mark chapter 10, It says that, and calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be the slave of all." You know, Jesus illustrated in his own life that rather than asking, "What can I do to be in charge?" the question is just, "What can I do? How can I serve?" You know, it was Jesus who washed feet. That had to be really embarrassing for the apostles. You know, but it was he who washed feet while they were arguing over who would be the greatest. You know, we're called then to stand in the place where Jesus stood, to stand in a place of service. You know, the object is not to work my way up to leadership, but the object is to work my way into places of service. You know, how can I see Jesus on his knees with a basin of water and say, "There's just nothing I can do. There's really, not any way that I can help." You know, Jesus showed his greatness by being a household servant and doing what nobody else wanted to do. I might want to speak in front of thousands of people, but it may be that really what we need is somebody to move folding chairs to set up for something. You know, I might want to, have some great position of leadership, but what we really need is somebody to cut the grass. I might, sometimes we think about, what it would mean to serve God and overlook, all the many, many ways we can serve God just by being willing to and giving ourselves to him. When I think of no little people and no little places, I'm reminded of two statements I heard somewhere along the way. One was that when we stand before God, he won't ask me why I wasn't Moses. He'll ask me why I wasn't me. And the other statement that I like is, bloom where you're planted. I might wish that I might see myself in a beautiful, royal, formal garden, but maybe I'm sort of in a weed-filled backyard. But I can bloom wherever I am. I can bloom where I'm planted. People who receive praise from God are not necessarily always leaders in this life, and not necessarily people who did big, great, important things. There are many sticks of wood close to God, used in power by him, in places that may look small to man. Being a Christian means being the rod of God in the place where God has put me. This morning, if you're not a Christian, we would encourage you to think about turning your life over to God. That's what we're talking about. And to submit to him in faith and repentance and baptism, and to commit yourself to serving wherever he puts you and in whatever way you can. If this morning you are a Christian but need in some way the encouragement or the prayers of this church, we would encourage you to come and let us do that as well while we stand together and sing.